So, should I get started? Okay. Greetings, welcome everyone. Thank you for coming to our Friday lecture. Very special guest has joined us for this lecture today. I've been told that I should indicate my name, rank, and serial number. I'm Zephyr Frank, and I teach in the history department. And it's my great pleasure to introduce today's speaker, Myrna Santiago. And the topic of our lecture will be the Empire and Natural Disasters, the 1931 Earthquake, and American Occupation of Nicaragua. This lecture is being live streamed and will continue to be public in our CLAS YouTube page after the event, so bear that in mind. And those of you who are online may submit questions and comments via the YouTube chat. And Alberto will read them to our speaker during the Q&A session at the end of the talk. For those of us at Stanford, we are in the land and territory of the Ohlone original peoples. We offer gratitude to the land, water, and air that surround us, and pay our respects to past, present, and future Ohlone peoples who continue to be present in their homelands and throughout their diasporas. Okay, I've got two introductions here, the first of which is the official one. This is for Myrna Santiago, professor of history at St. Mary's College of California, where she is also director of women's and gender studies and teaches Latin American environmental history in the environmental studies program. She received her PhD from Berkeley in 1997. Her published work is focused on social and environmental aspects of the Mexican oil industry, extractive industry in general. Her current project focuses on two earthquakes, we're going to hear about one of those today, that destroyed the capital city of Managua, Nicaragua, in 1931 and again in 1972. Originally from the deserts of Tijuana, Mexico, Professor Santiago considers herself naturalized Bay Area resident. Absolutely. Just wanted to add a couple other points here. That was a very nice introduction, I think, the staff for providing that. Professor Santiago is one of the leading authorities in the field of Latin American environmental history and in environmental history more broadly. And I want to highlight the importance of some of her previous work, including The Ecology of Oil, Environment, Labor in the Mexican Revolution. This was published by Cambridge University Press, the flagship press for Latin American history, and it won the Latin American Studies Association Bryce Wood Book Award, the Melville Prize, and other major prizes. And I know that you've heard this all before, but I think it needs to be recognized and acknowledged that we have here with us a prize-winning and pioneering environmental historian who has done great service to her university and to the profession more broadly, winning many awards, Professor of the Year, things like that. In other words, if you read her bio, you'll be very envious or you'll feel inadequate. There's also a personal history that I'm not going to get into here that is incredibly fascinating, and it's an example of a person who's lived the kind of life that I think many of us would aspire to or wish that we could have lived. And I'll just say, I was only 14, when the great moments that in Myrna's early life took place, and some of those adventures and experiences. So I wasn't able to go off and have those experiences and adventures.
Go off and join the revolution?
Yes. Okay, so you can put it that way. So without further ado, let's turn things over to Professor Santiago.
Thank you. Thanks, everybody, for inviting me, and thank you for coming today, making time out of your day. We'll get right into it so that we'll have plenty of time for questions, and then later we can tell you about how this emerged and where we are. But Managua is, let me show you these things. Managua was a small city in 1931. So here is the city. It had between 40 to 60,000 inhabitants laid out in a grid, bounded on the north by the by the Xolotlan Lake or the Lake Managua, and then on the south by the Laguna de Tizcapa. And this is, let's see if I can, this point, does it have, no, does it have a pointer? Let me just point to you, this is where a lot of the action is taking place, Campo de Marte, because that's where the Marines were stationed. It was about 1.5 miles from east to west, 1 mile from north to south. So it was a compact city in the old style of, old Spanish cities. The cathedral had not been built yet. So what you get is just this very compact, the one row after the next of buildings. This is what that looked like in 1931. This was the end of the city on the south side. And that's where, at the top was where the presidential palace was and where that was happening. During Holy Week of 1931, specifically on March 31st, is when we have this particular earthquake. What you need to know about Holy Week in Nicaragua is that it is extremely hot and it's humid. So nature plays a big role in here. And most people leave, if they can afford it, the upper classes leave the city during this particular period. In addition to being hot and humid, because the rains are coming, but they're not coming in about a month, and at the end of April, you get these winds that are like really hot, the equivalent of our Southern California Santa Ana winds. So this was a situation when on the Tuesday of Holy Week, there was a series of quake. It was not just one quake. It's referred to as a 1931 quake, but it was a series of quakes that took place over a period of 2 minutes, with the first one being the strongest quake, and then a total of about 8 seconds of quick succession of the city quaking. The city started to crumble. Then this is around 10:32 in the morning. By 10:45, in around 15 to 20 minutes, the fire started. So then you have, the whole city not only falling down, but also catching fire. And by catching fire, that included the American embassy as well, what was then called the legation, because it was not called an embassy yet. So this is the site of something that is going to become very difficult to control. You can imagine the scene. Because it was Holy Week, the president of the country at the time, a general by the name of Jose Maria Moncada Tapia, here you can see the seriousness of the quake. Oh, I should say that we don't know, we don't have a scale to measure it, because in 1931, there was no scale. The Mercalli scale was not quite, there were no instruments in Central America to measure it. The Richter scale that we're used to had not been invented yet. So the literature has everything from 4.7 to 6.2. But it's all in retrospect because there were no instruments to measure it at the time. But this gives you a sense of how serious it was. And then this is the National Palace afterwards, the level of destruction. Most of the construction was made of what was called taquesal, which is what you see there. So it meant that a lot of it fell because there were reeds that were held together with mud inside. That made it so that the fire spread really, really fast. Because once the plaster fell off, everything was made of dry reeds and earth in general. So this is the president. So President Moncada was out of town, and the other man of the hour, the minister Matthew Hanna, was also out of town. They were not there, right? Because it's Tuesday or Holy Week. So what happens then is that there is a vacuum of authority, quite literally. There is nobody in Managua to decide what to do about this. So what happens immediately is the scenes of a narrative of panic and horror. That is what is in the records as people are trying to figure out what to do to get if they can get people out of the ruins, or if they can get away from the fire. And what happens next is that the Marines take over. The Marines were occupying Nicaragua at this period of time. They've been there since 1912. They had left in 1925. They had come back in 1925. They're supposed to leave in 1932 after elections take place. So this is about a year before they are supposed to leave. The overwhelming majority of the Marines are in the northern part of the country because they're chasing down Augusto Cesar Sandino, right? They're trying to put down his rebellion at this point. So the Marine in charge, or the Marine that is in the highest ranking Marine at the time, at the Campo de Marte, which is the headquarters of the U.S. occupation in Managua, declares martial law. So he declares martial law and gets going on trying to figure out what they're going to do about the fire. They say that his work is, quote, to assist in rescue work and in order to maintain order among the panic-stricken inhabitants and to safeguard their property by preventing looting and pillage, right? The first thing that they do is that they call on, once martial law has been declared, they call on the Army Corps of Engineers, which has a detachment in Nicaragua, because they're still looking at this question of building a canal through Nicaragua as well. They're in Granada, which is a city a little bit to the south east of Nicaragua, and they rapidly come into town, right? So the quake starts around 10:32. By 3 o'clock, the Army Corps of Engineers is already in Managua. They are setting up a perimeter around to figure out how to fight the fire. That's the number one. That's their specific job. The National Guard, which is the body that the U.S. has already set up, they set it up in 1927 as what they were hoping would be an apolitical force to keep order in the country, and so that they wouldn't continue to be intervening, is under the command of another American Marine, and they set up sort of a perimeter. They're trying to set up a perimeter around the part of that has collapsed, and the earth continues to move because the aftershocks will be many. The president doesn't come back until Tuesday evening. So he makes it back from where he is on Tuesday evening. It is not until Wednesday that he just confirms the order of martial law. So the city is clearly in the possession of the Americans, which had not been the case before, because the presence of the Marines had only been felt in the northern parts where there was actually fighting going on. So what happens afterwards, this is what I'll tell you a little bit more detail, is that what we see is that the Americans display this massive, this military display that is just massive, that cannot be called anything but some kind of humanitarian military invasion of Managua, for sure. By the evening of the Wednesday morning, the minister, Hanna, this guy right here, arrives from Guatemala, where he was vacationing, and he takes over, even though the president was already there. He takes over the reins of what's going to become the Committee for the Central Relief Committee, the CRC. And the CRC is made up of 5 men. The official head is Moncada, but he's not going to show up to anything. So the other 5 men is Hanna himself, he's the president, and then a colonel, a general, and a sole Nicaraguan member who is the acting Minister for Foreign Affairs, Anastasio Somoza Garcia, in representation of Moncada. Nobody in all of the literature talks about how Somoza was part of this committee. And that was something that I also didn't know that he was part of it, and that in many ways that will be the cost of doing this. So here you have these 5 men, a very masculine affair, right? With a really, really terrific problem that they have to deal with. Lots of dead, lots of wounded, and a great deal of concern about the fire continuing because the winds are just fueling the fire, and the fire keeps spreading. Practically, of the 40 to 60,000 people, about half of them are homeless already because the stuff is burning so quickly. About another 20,000 people will leave the city by whatever ways they can over the next 48 hours. So the Central Relief Committee has their hands full, right? They have a fire, they have search and rescue, there is no water, there was never a firefighting corps at all before, so there isn't going to be one now. There is no water because, this is a little further ahead, but let me just show you. Show you the lake. Oh, here's the lake. Because the lake where all the water mains that come to the city, where the pumping goes on, has had a slide, and the slide, which actually slid with some people on it, women who were doing the laundry, have covered the pumping station. So there is no water. So they are in really serious crisis. They're going to have to figure out what to do by way of feeding people. They have lots of wounded and injured that have to be taken care of. And they are really worried about all these environmental conditions. For now, the fact that the winds are really whipping the fire, and then at the same time, the concern that in about a month, it's going to start to rain. So if they don't get this under control, they're really worried what this might mean in terms of epidemics particularly. And because there's no water, they are really concerned about the question of epidemics becoming a real serious issue for sure. They also have to contend with the question of sewage. The piping didn't break for the little bit of sewage that there was, but the fact that there's no water means that there is no functioning sewage system at all. So what I see from the record is that really what happens next is that the Central Coordinating Committee mobilize, American military power to contend with what nature had left them in Managua, right? And all the various parts of the things that they needed to do were things that they were totally equipped to doing, because these are armies. They can set up mess halls, right, in like 3 hours. They can set up field hospitals in about as much time. They can set up refugee camps really quickly because they can mobilize them, and they can feed people in huge numbers very quickly. And that's what they said to do. The HANA researched to get, so this is the American legation burned down. So HANA doesn't have a home himself either. So he's in the Campo de Marte himself, with 900 Americans who are living in Nicaragua as well, and they're going to have to be evacuated. So you get, by Tuesday evening, the cables going back and forth to Washington with a massive mobilization of support to get through the emergency period. They're sending right away the Chamont, and I was so happy that I found a picture of what it looked like. This boat's coming from San Diego, and that boat's going to be in charge of evacuating all the Americans living in Managua who are not part of of the Marines, their families and the families of diplomats. Pan American Airlines has made available 6 commercial airliners for whatever relief works needs to be done. There's going to be 2 more warships coming from 3 more. 1 from New York, 1 from Cuba, 1 from the Panama Canal. So from all sides, the U.S. is able to mobilize, right, continental-wide forces to focus on Managua on this specific disaster. And that will have an enormous impact on the way this is managed, right? Sidelining the Nicaraguans completely. I mean, we can talk about that because that'll be a different chapter. The Army Corps of Engineers is setting up the perimeter for the fire, and they're using dynamite to blast buildings because there is no water, and they're creating fire breaks. At that time, it wasn't quite an experimental, tool, because they had used dynamite to try to stop the fire in the 1906 fire in San Francisco, but it didn't work out so well because I think it has to be more precise than it is. So it wasn't working out so well here either, right? So it's kind of experimental, but if it works, it's a good technique. If it's a good method, if it doesn't work, then there will be problems with them. So this is Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday, Friday. By Saturday, the fire is under control. Right? And by that I mean is that they had contained the fire to the perimeter that they had set up, and it was burning there, but it was no longer spreading. Part of it in the record recognizes was that the winds kind of slacked down. So the Marines are saying we're so lucky, right? At this point, Providence helped us so that the winds are no longer moving it in that direction. So by this time, we have about 31 blocks of the city that are completely consumed by fire, and the rest will continue to burn for a longer period, but it's no longer going to continue to spread. They're very worried about the specter of disease coming. During the first day, as well, they were not yet setting up at a perimeter in Nicaragua, and Managuans were coming to try to recover their wounded and try to recover their dead. People were taking their dead to the cemetery on the outskirts of town and trying to bury them. The Marines put a stop to that very quickly because of the fear of disease. Instead of allowing people to carry the bodies all the way to the edge of the city, they started collecting all the bodies and cremating them like in a pile right there in front of the population. Within a few hours, by Thursday, but this is Tuesday, this is Wednesday, by Thursday, they weren't even doing that. The National Guard and the Marines, whatever body they found that they could pull out of the wreckage, they would pour gasoline on it and they would burn it right there. So you can begin to see what this is going to provoke for the Nicaraguan population over the long term. So these funeral pyres are happening all over the place. They are also, because they're so concerned about the epidemics, they have orders to shoot every animal on sight. And you have some very gruesome scenes that I've seen in the literature about the numbers of animals that are roaming through the rubble. So they're shooting all the animals as well. So again, without asking anybody, including shooting the animals and the pets of the families of the Americans who were there. The hospitals are working day and night, which to bring in the wounded, and because again there's not much that you can do at this particular junction with these kinds of wounds. It's a lot of amputations taking place, right? Again, in a field hospital that they just set up. The Washington promises vaccines coming within 48 hours from Panama. They're going to be coming from the Panama Canal, and then from New York, and they get those, and they are. Let me see where they're coming. everything under the sun. Tetanus, plague, smallpox. I'm trying to remember what else. I'll find them in a minute. And the Marines set up a system to feed people once they set up the mobile mess halls, so that as people are waiting for their meals, and they're going to be setting up a system where they get fed, breakfast, lunch, and dinner, first from Marine rations that they have right there in Managua, but then they're bringing in rations from the U.S. because they have the problem, another compounding problem that is beyond their control, that there's been drought in Nicaragua. So food prices are already skyrocketing. So you don't have the kinds of the grains that people are used to. Rice and beans are going to be very expensive. And they can get as much as they can from the countryside. And the Marines stop fighting Sandino, and they use the planes that they're using in the north to bring whatever beans and rice they can find from the north. But there's just not enough, because there's already a stress on the food supply in the country because of the drought. So they're going to be coming from the U.S. And as soon as they set up the mess halls and people are lining up for food, they get their vaccines while they're waiting in line. Right? I thought that was interesting, considering what we've been going through in questions of vaccines. So water, sanitation, and food. Right? It was some of the main concerns once they were getting all the people vaccinated. Drinking water was the first one that they focused on after the fire, or at the same time. A different group of Marines is involved in this, and they came up with ways to rig. They took over the brewery, commanded all of the barrels that they used for beer, brought them into the center of the city, and used water from the lake, which at the time it was drinkable. Today it's like you don't even want to touch that lake because it's just so unbelievably polluted. And then just throw chlorine on it and make it available to people, so they were able to have potable water for the people that were homeless within by the late Tuesday night, early Wednesday. Within 24 hours, and then within the next couple of days, they were able to tap into what used to be old wells before they set up the more modern system of having a main bringing the water from the Asososca Lagoon, and use those to have some running water, because the pipes had not broken. It was just that you couldn't get to the pumping. So they were able to get water within about 72 hours for the entire population, right? So you get everybody vaccinated within 72 hours. Everybody has access to water within 72 hours or less. The fire is set up within 5, is cleaned up within or contained within 5 days. Oh, here's the campaign. Typhoid, cowpox, tetanus was coming from the Panama Canal and elsewhere. So while these kinds of situations, it's kind of hard to pinpoint exactly when the emergency phase is over. The thing that lasted the longest was fixing the pipeline for the water. That was done by April 20th. So I think we can certainly say that by April 20th, the emergency was over, completely over, because now everybody had access to water. They didn't have housing, but then you get into a new phase, right? The phase of recovery and reconstruction. But we can see even earlier that the Marines felt that the emergency was under control enough to have the arrival of entertainer Will Rogers to Managua. I mean, I take that as a sign of their seeing, we have this under control. We can manage this. We can get somebody from, he's allowed to come to the U.S. He lands in the capital on Tuesday, April 7, 7 days after the major quakes. to entertain the troops, and then to do a little disaster tourism. So he's out there touring the downtown area. There, somebody is filming. I haven't been able to establish who is filming, and I have not seen the film. I've been looking for it for years and I can't find it. But he's being filmed. The film will eventually appear, or very quickly will appear in American theaters as part of the newsreels, so Americans will be able to see what this disaster is looking like. And Will Rogers will write a letter to the New York Times with nothing but praise for the Marines, our boys in uniform, of course, and their sacrifice, etc., their heroic work, and then asking Americans to provide as much support as possible. And you will get all kinds of solidarity committees all over the place. San Francisco will be a major site as well. So Rogers is, officially celebrating the work of the Marines. The American press is effusive about the work of the Marines. So that's when you see a lot of this, where I'm seeing a lot of this praise for a very particular type of American masculinity, and then the way in which they are presenting, by contrast, the Nicaraguans, particularly the president, whom they talk about the president as being very nervous, and his nerves being quite sort of shocked or unstable, which then you can compare to the nervous breakdown that American women are having as they are leaving Managua. So clearly what I see there is sort of the feminization of Moncada, at least in the American press. Not the official archives, both of the Marines and then of the State Department, is very careful in how they talk about Moncada, but the press is not. And we can talk about this as well. So the thing is here that mobilization of American military power meant that it was in 3 weeks. In 3 weeks, the whole place was almost cleaned up. Right? Because then they organize brigades for cleaning up, and they're going to get paid, and they're getting food for getting paid. They actually don't forget about women. The Nicaraguans make it very clear on the record that they're worried about only hiring men because there's so many Nicaraguan women who are heads of household. So they got to have specific jobs for the women. Besides like cooking and taking care of those, that kind of work, the women are also hired to do some of the light cleanup. And all the cleanup is going to be removed, and then eventually a lot of it thrown into the lake. So that's an environmental issue of some proportion. And other will be recycled to repave streets and to pave new streets. Right? So it's all very carefully laid out. But it's not the American press who are the only ones that are really effusive about the behavior and the actions of the Marines. President Moncada is like all smiles, and he is so grateful, and he's effusive. He speaks in English before American cameras, saying, quote, "The generous American cooperation given by the Marine Corps, the Guardia Nacional, the Canal Commission, and the American Red Cross impelled the Nicaraguan government to express public recognition to the government and the people of the United States in the most eloquent manner possible in human language." The Nicaraguan ambassador in D.C., a guy by the name of Juan Bautista Sacasa, who will win the elections in 1992, by the way, goes on CBS radio in the U.S. thanking the president, the Red Cross, the Department of State, the Department of the War, the Department of the Navy, for setting in motion, quote, "the wheels of all the machinery of relief that your mighty nation commands." And he says, quote, "Meanwhile, from the first moment, Nicaragua can be thankful that the Marines and the Corps of Army Engineers, who were serving the proposed canal route were on hand and ready to cooperate with the National Guard in keeping order and establishing martial law, dispensing food to the hungry and medical aid to the injured, and doing necessary relief work of every description, from digging among the heaped-up ruins to burying the pitiful bodies found beneath them, right? So, as much as this could be performative in some ways, and you want to keep the Americans on your side, etc., there is a very sincere thankfulness on the part of the Nicaraguan elite vis-a-vis the Americans. On June 1st, Moncada confers the Presidential Medal of Merit on 19 officers of the U.S. Army, Navy, and the Marines, and then later on at a separate ceremony from Hana. Okay. Now, this is where it gets kind of tricky, right? Because they were an occupation force. They are fighting a guerrilla war against a nationalist movement, but yet there is no question. There is just no question that Nicaragua never would have been able to deal with this earthquake on its own. It was just too poor. It was just too small a country. And they could have never mobilized what the Marines were able to do, right? And move towards the reconstruction phase in only 3 weeks. And it wouldn't have made it any easier, even the fact, especially because we're talking about the Great Depression here. And Nicaragua was really suffering because their coffee crop was having a lot of problems, right, already. It's also true, and this is where things start to get a little bit interesting, is that the Marines, or whoever was involved in here, mistranslated a number of words of appreciations that the Nicaraguans use, and it's very interesting to see it in the record, because when the Moncada, for example, used the term salvamento, which really ought to be translated as salvaging, it's translated in the record as saving. So every time that Moncada thanks the Marines for their work of salvaging the city, in the official record and then in the American press, it comes out as Moncada thanking the Marines for saving the city, which fits quite nicely, right, with the whole ideology of American imperialism at the time, which was of, providing, bringing civilization to small, uncivilized nations. That paternalistic masculine self-image, it comes through when you see that. Because my argument is that the Marines and Americans in general, from the elite side, understood Nicaragua in a very particular way that affected the aftermaths. And I'll read a little bit here. I'm almost coming to the last bit, so we'll have plenty of time to talk. Americans saw Nicaragua as a backwater where both nature and men were disordered, even if they were charming. The country was hot, humid, rainy, wet. A jungle full of insects, quote, alligators, snakes, and scorpions, not to mention the fleas and the ticks. And this is from the head of the Army Corps of Engineers. But he says nature is kind to the locals and provides what the natives need. So the social expression of this type of natural environment was easy to see. You have disorder nature, so then you have a disorder society. Quote unquote banditry, quote unquote fratricide of wars, political instability. The very reasons why the Marines had been intervening in Nicaraguan politics since 1912, quote, to find a way of bringing quiet to the country. The earthquake highlighted the risk of further disorder. If not contained, the disorder in the capital could open the door for unrest in the capital and for Sandino's insurgent forces to come down from the northern part of the country, rumors of which abounded. They were really scared that Sandino was going to take advantage of, as I saw, take advantage of the crisis and of the disaster to attack the city. Those reasons accounted for the declaration of martial law, not with a repressive intent, but as a quote-unquote humanitarian gesture. Hannah, who was a graduate of West Point, explained the logic in an interview he gave in El Salvador. And he said, cuando sobrevino la tremenda catástrofe que materialmente destruyó la capital de Nicaragua, sobrevino un caos absoluto. No había más que desorden, anarquía, confusión, right? When the earthquake came, there was a tremendous catastrophe, destroyed the city. It was total chaos. Chaos, anarchy, disorder, confusion. So the humanitarian impulse for the common good led to the initial shootings of looters widely reported in the American press. On April 4th, both the New York Times and the LA Times were reporting that the National Guard had shot up to 20 men within the first 72 hours of the earthquakes. I have to dig more in terms of I want to think through what was the effect, if any, on the National Guard itself as a body of having participated in this disaster, but I don't have enough evidence right now. But it's very clear that their performance as a humanitarian force left much to be desired. Because what is interesting in the record is that the Hannah and the Marines immediately dispute to the State Department that many people had been killed in the looter as a result of martial law. But the way they say in the record is the Marines did not kill anybody, leaving the door open to say, or for somebody to assume it was the National Guard, i.e. Nicaraguans killed Nicaraguans, Americans did not, right? So there's an interesting omission there for sure. Sandino never came close to Managua. He sent out like a message of encouragement to the population, but he never came down for the mountains for sure. So for now, at least, the occupiers had triumphed over disorderly men and nature, reimposing order over both. The missionary work that Frances Sultan is the woman who's married to the head of the Army Corps of Engineers, attributed to her husband and his compatriots, was accomplished by force through martial law. Now, Somoza Garcia. Right? Somoza Garcia. If there is a consensus about anything related to Anastasio Somoza Garcia, it's that he was a creature of the United States. You know, there's a book that was published in 2013 that I just run into that is called America's Favorite SOB, written by an American. So Somoza Garcia was Moncada's man. He was the second cousin to the president. He was also the liaison to the Marines because he spoke English, right? And he was his candidate for the position of Jefe Director of the National Guard in 1932. But Juan Bautista Sacasa, who was the ambassador, won the elections. And even though Somoza Garcia was married to Juan Bautista Sacasa's niece, so Somoza is linked to both, he had his own candidates to replace General Matthews, taking over the Guard. And he also knew that Nicaraguan field commanders didn't want Somoza because Somoza had never seen combat, and he was the interim foreign minister. Anastasio Somoza de Baile, the son of Somoza Garcia and the last of the Somozas in power, recalled in his memoirs that in addition to his father, there were two other men under consideration for the coveted position as head of the National Guard. But according to Somoza de Baile, the son, he believes that, quote, President Sacasa nominated General Somoza, and his nomination met the approval of Moncada, who happened to be my father's cousin. This nomination was then submitted to General Matthews of the U.S. Marine Corps and U.S. Ambassador Hanna. The selection of General Somoza met with their approval, and that's how General Somoza became commander of the Nicaraguan Guardia Nacional, right? It was approved by Hanna, and it was approved by the Marine who was the head of the National Guard at the time. The Americans loved Somoza Garcia. They really did. They knew him really well. Somoza Garcia had met the Secretary of State, Henry L. Stimson, when Stimson had gone down to Managua in 1927 to broker a peace agreement, left a very good impression on Stimson, who wrote about it in his diary. Minister Hanna also thought very highly of Somoza. Somoza Garcia was friends with the ambassador. He was a regular guest at the legation's social event. Oh, they talk a lot about what a great dancer he was, because he always used to be dancing with Mrs. Hanna because the ambassador was not a good dancer. So they identified with him, and they saw him as one of them. So the question is, this would lead to a very close working relationship between Somoza, whom the Nicaraguans saw as very capable, whom the Americans saw as very capable, but also as a social climber. This guy was a social climber. Somoza Garcia was also the president of the Nicaraguan Red Cross, and then the president of the Nicaraguan's government, Comité Nacional de Emergencia, that was dealing with Latin American countries that were providing aid. So Somoza Garcia was in charge of anything that the Nicaraguans were doing, that the Nicaraguan government was doing vis-a-vis the earthquake, and he was sitting in the Central Committee run by the Americans. So that meant that Somoza Garcia worked with the Americans every single day for the duration of the Central Committee, which was 4.5 months. So he got to work with them very, very closely. They loved them. He was not a Marine, but he was as close to Marine qualities as the Americans were concerned, and he was the man that the Americans trusted the most. So Somoza Garcia's work in the Emergency Committee, I think I can confidently say, is that changed the course of Nicaraguan history. Right? Although nobody talks about his role in the committee. That got completely buried altogether from the historical record. So it's kind of fun to see that, there is a reason why the Americans were so in love with this guy. Managua will be rebuilt by Somoza's dictatorship after the quake, but the history shows the reconstruction of Managua would end up being a Pyrrhic victory. The earth would have the last word and destroy the capital again in 1972. Tacho was long dead by then, executed by a student in 1956. And then in the meantime, Nicaraguans forged a very different narrative about 1931 and its aftermath, rejecting this humanitarian version that the occupying forces preserve in the U.S. archives and the one that I'm presenting you here. So let me just summarize this so you get the sense of my argument. So earthquakes are natural, their consequences are not. Consequences are social. They depend on the historical context framing the movements of the earth. Yet they're similar to earthquakes in one aspect. The socio-political effects of telluric movements are not predictable. Many factors come into play. In the case of Managua, we do not know what the social effects of the earthquake would have been had the Marines not been occupying the country in 1931. But we do know that the aftermath would have been totally different without the massive resources that the U.S. mobilized to respond to the challenges of the moment. The decisions the Marines made, moreover, not only attenuated the effects of the earthquake, but also altered the path of Nicaraguan politics, and in the long term, Nicaraguan state formation itself. As Mark Healy showed for the case of Argentina and Juan Perón, an earthquake could boost the military career of charismatic and ambitious young officers to the long-term detriment of Nicaragua. That certainly was the case for Somoza Garcia in 1931. So, thank you for listening. Let me just see you a little bit more. I want to show you just the two of these. I just have two more slides. Because Somoza, once he has killed Sandino in 34, and then he's overthrown his wife's uncle in 36, he has a set of commemorative stamps about the 1931 earthquake, which come out in 1939, but they're all focused on the Americans. Right? So this is one of those. This one focuses on Rogers being received by the American Marines. The only one that sort of deals with this is this one, which is a picture of the National Palace before and the National Palace after. All the other ones are grateful, maybe a representation of his personal gratitude towards the Americans and their role in the 1931 earthquake. So you have that narrative, which is going to be very different from the narrative of other elite Nicaraguans and then ordinary Nicaraguans. Questions? Comments?
I think we're processing.
Yeah,
there's a lot of questions.
There's a lot. Well, I'll tell you a little bit of sort of where I am with this, because I originally started a project that was just going to focus on the 1972 earthquake, and this continues to be my big theoretical question here is wanting to, how do you write an environmental history of an earthquake? Because an earthquake is different from, I've come to the conclusions, earthquakes are fundamentally different from all other natural occurrences. Because they're so unpredictable, because you don't have a relationship with earthquakes. Like we can have a relationship with animals, with plants, with forests, with rivers. We can make them work, we can destroy them, we can, whatever. There's our interactions. We don't interact with earthquakes. They do it to us. And then we just have to deal with the aftermath. So the options for people in terms of earthquakes is either preparedness or, in the absence of, or even with preparedness, is just response in the aftermath. And you never know when they're coming, right? You don't see them coming like hurricanes. You don't see them coming like, a Pineapple Express. You don't see them coming like storms. You don't see them coming like tornadoes. They just happen at any time.
You're making me feel very nervous.
I know, we live in earthquake country, right? I think about earthquakes all the time. I carry an earthquake kit in my car, which I recommend everybody does, because who knows where you'll be. So then, this question of theorizing nature is giving me headaches. But then the other thing that once I started researching the 1972 earthquake, there's a lot of work about the political and social consequences of that. Mostly the consensus is that, this was almost the last straw that broke the camel's back against Somoza and eventually the end of the dictatorship. But as I was researching that, I ran into this 1931 earthquake. So the city had already been destroyed once. And it was the first Anastasio Somoza who built it. And it'll be the last Anastasio Somoza who will face the results of another earthquake. So my whole arc of the narrative has changed. I don't have it fully worked out yet. But I am still sort of trying to deal with this whole question of then how do you theorize environment, nature, earth, into across the whole thing, so that it can really be a contribution to environmental history. I mean, no matter what I write, it'll be a contribution to just social political Nicaraguan history, but I'm much more interested in trying to figure out what is a good environmental angle to take here. And I'm not sure yet.
So there's a question coming from the audience online. So Hector Hoyos, I think it's Hector Hoyos, I'm pretty sure it is. He says, thank you for the talk. I'll leave a comment. He wants to recommend to you Fernanda Melchor's Temporada de Huracanes. I read it actually over the summer. As a literary take on environmental and political history, both intertwined. And then he sends greetings from Bigot Hall.
Okay, yeah. Yeah, I'm not familiar with that one. Yeah.
It's it's her first novel. Very
It's
striking.
fantastic.
Very rough read. Tell you the truth, but you've read it? Yeah.
Yes.
No, it will give you nightmares. It's a good book.
It will give you nightmares, huh?
Yeah, the literature on hurricanes is really good. I mean, the stuff that that historians have done on the Caribbean is amazing on hurricanes. Yeah.
Can I ask you another one from Scott Langford? He's asking, would it be remotely accurate to call this an early textbook base of disaster capitalism? Are there any useful parallels to more recent earthquake responses elsewhere, such as Haiti?
That's a good question. And I am going to say no for the following reasons. One is this happens in the middle of the Depression, so it's going to take a while for Nicaragua to dig itself under. This is 1931, right? Their economy is on a tailspin because they can't export coffee. Nobody's buying coffee. And in some ways, I think 1972 is much more. For 1972, yes, you can absolutely positively make the case of disaster capitalism. No question about it. I mean, Somoza himself talks about it. He talks about, he sees the 1972 earthquake as, quote unquote, a revolution of opportunities. Because now everybody's going to make a buck if you play your cards right, because you got to rebuild the city. I don't see that yet here for 1931. Because one of the debates that happens right after, or as this is happening, is whether or not they should move the capital. Right? When lots of people say, we should just leave. Why are we building here? This place, we should not rebuild. And there's strong political interest on all sides of the arguments about moving the capital. But because of the historical rivalries between the liberals and the conservatives in Nicaragua, two factions of the elites, and how much they can't come to an agreement on anything, it is that then by default, Managua ends up being the capital. There are a couple of people that say that Nicaragua ended up remaining the capital because Hannah said so, Hannah Matthews. I haven't seen any evidence of that, but the fact that Nicaraguans believe that in itself is important, right? So the capital remains in Nicaragua, and the rebuilding is going to have to take into account stuff like the Great Depression and how much money is going to be available for rebuilding, et cetera, et cetera. So I think it's a little early, well, because in 1931, I mean, capitalism was on its knees, right? So it's the disaster capitalism was capitalism itself. So I don't think it fits quite well yet, but it will later. Yeah.
Can I ask a question? I mean, just following up on this.
Sure.
So I'm Mexican, and for me, 1985, that's the big earthquake in Mexico City. I was trying to find one of those images, and I don't know if they have been censored, but the thing I most remember is the face of the president as this helpless, useless man. He was like this, the emperor has no clothes. And it strikes me so much because this is almost like the way I read your presentation is, and Somoza has Americans as his friends. so it's a very different outcome you get from being a completely ineffective president, which I remember kind of is the beginning of the end of the PRI, versus this, which is also Somoza has Americans, the stamp you showed us. that buys you 50 years of dictatorship, I think. I don't know. I mean,
Yeah. That's why it's so interesting. If you take the trajectory of both, right? The 1930, the larger argument is that if we're going to look in terms of sort of Nicaraguan politics and state formation, the 1931 earthquake allowed for the rise of the Somoza dynasty. The 1972 was what broke it and brought it to its end, right? So in that way, it's kind of unpredictable. Mm-hmm. It just happens that the first Somoza Garcia, was at the right time, at the right place, and he spoke English. Nobody else, that was local spoke English. Sacasa did, but he was in the U.S. And by all accounts, Somoza Garcia was incredibly charming. He was a used car salesman, literally. So he managed to charm the pants out of the Americans, and they were very eager by this time to really get out of Nicaragua. So who are we going to trust but the guy that we trust, who has proven to be totally loyal in those 4 months of daily interaction with him. Right? I wish I knew much more about his actual role within those 4 months. Most of what the Americans say is just a lot of praise and a lot of how efficient he was, how good he was, how earnest he was, how collaborative he was, but they don't tell you did he do anything specific? We don't know. Yeah, but Moncada does appear in the record the same way as the Mexican president. Yeah. So yeah.
Thank you so much for that super interesting and engaging presentation. I was wondering if you could speak more about the idea of disordered nature or and disordered backwater, and how was that a representation taking place in the American media, and when was it coming up, and how did it kind of transform over time?
Yeah, that comes out of just in the American media and the writings of the American guys themselves, and then it also comes out of my previous work on American attitudes towards Latin America, and then specifically towards Mexico, and then even more specifically towards the rainforest, that I got out of working on the American archives vis-a-vis the Mexican oil industry that began in the tropical rainforests. So there's a whole lot more really good descriptions of the Mexican case. There's less for the Nicaraguan case. But clearly it's the same. So there's tons of there is quite a bit of evidence about how American policymakers and Americans going to Latin America in the 19th and early 20th century that ended up in tropical regions, how they saw this as such an alien place. Such an uncontrollable place, such a place that was really not good for white men, because it is so hot, because it's humid, because it's got bugs, because it's got animals that are trying to eat you, because everything grows so fast and you chop it down and you can't put in a road because it rains and then the road goes away. So it's not that difficult to find. Yeah.
Hi. So talking about Nicaragua and the environment. What comes to my mind is kind of the United Fruit Company and the monoculture that had an object that was, excuse me, part of the reason why the Marines were in Nicaragua in the first place. I was wondering if they had a role in recovering from the earthquake at all.
Who the
United Fruit
Fruit?
Company, yeah, and the association lobbying and connections to government that they had.
I have not seen the United Fruit Company hasn't shown up anywhere in the records that I've seen, and they would have been in the Atlantic coast, which was at this point in time, pretty physically remote because there's no infrastructure to get there. In fact, some of what Sandino is doing while everybody's busy with the earthquake in Managua is attacking United Fruit and some of the mines and other places on the Atlantic coast. So the bulk of the Marines are still there because they're still attacking American interests that way. I will have to see what happens in the reconstruction phase, but it's not, I haven't seen it anywhere. It's not showing up. Yeah, it's not showing up.
Can I ask one more question?
Sure. Yes,
and
please.
We're going to have to close the broadcast because we try to keep that one in an hour, and we've gone over that. But Maria Aparecida Lopez asked you,
Maria
hi
Aparecida.
Myrna, it's so nice to see you. Congratulations on a wonderful topic. While researching the topic, did you find any information about food aid from the US?
Yes. It was not the preferred. The preferred option was Nicaragua, getting the food from Nicaragua itself. And they do that. And the Marines go to Jinotega and Matagalpa and places in the north, which is sort of the breadbasket of the country, to try to procure as much of the food as possible, both for the food that they're making to support the people that they're feeding 3 times a day, and then also for the dry rations that they're going to be giving to people as they are able to, begin to stabilize themselves in a little bit. But as I mentioned, there wasn't enough because of the drought. So at that point, it is that they go to the U.S. for food aid. And the record is very clear that it is, some of it is from the American government. The immediate rations are from the American government, but whatever the rest that they're going to buy, and there is a list. I can look it up and I can send it to you if you want. There is a list of what Hannah Matthews tells the State Department that they need, and then they're very specific about the kinds of beans that they want, because Nicaraguans are very picky about their beans, even in disaster. They don't want, the pinto beans or the black beans. They gotta have the little rojito, the little red bean that is very small. It's not a kidney bean. When they get kidney beans, they get very upset about it. And that is going to be supplied by private American companies, which I found interesting, although they're not named. But there are some private American companies that get involved in providing some of that food aid. And the rest will be local.
Okay, thank you again so much. It is our tradition to close the formal part of the talk around now, but it's also our tradition, and I hope to invite those of you who are able to stay, and if you are able to stay for a little bit longer, I think there's probably more conversation to be had.
On sabbatical. I'm happy to be here as long as you want.
Fantastic. So thank you again.